What happens when a powerful king trades away his strongest alliance for a promise of free land? He ends up with a humiliating defeat, a destroyed reputation, and exactly 6 li of dirt. That is not a metaphor. That is the story of King Huai of Chu, who fell for one of the oldest tricks in the political playbook, the promise of something too good to be true. His downfall came at the hands of Zhang Yi, a diplomat of Qin, whose silver tongue was sharper than any sword. This is not just a story about deception. It is a case study in how greed blinds leaders, how alliances are worth more than land, and how words can be more lethal than armies. Let's set the stage. The Warring States period was not a time of balance. It was a time of consolidation, betrayal, and survival. 7 major states, Qin, Chu, Qi, Zhao, Han, Wei, and Yan, competed in an arena where trust was a commodity no one could afford for long. Every state knew that alliances could turn overnight. Every leader understood that diplomacy could determine survival just as much as armies. Chu was one of the largest states geographically. It commanded immense natural resources, fertile lands, and manpower. But Chu had weaknesses. Its leadership was impulsive, its court politics were unstable, and its diplomacy was inconsistent. Qin, on the other hand, was geographically protected in the west and had developed a culture of ruthless efficiency. Qin's leaders understood that before they could unify China militarily, they had to weaken their opponents politically. That meant breaking alliances. At this time, the most dangerous threat to Qin was the alliance between Qi and Chu. Together, these two powers could check Qin's expansion. Qin's rulers knew that if they faced Chu and Qi united, they would have to commit enormous resources to fight wars on multiple fronts. But if they could peel Chu away from Qi, then Qin could deal with its rivals one at a time. That is where Zhang Yi enters the story. Zhang Yi was not a general. He was not a king. He was a professional persuader, a man trained in the arts of rhetoric and manipulation. He had risen from obscurity into the ranks of Qin's most trusted diplomats by mastering one skill: convincing rulers to act against their own best interests. Zhang Yi specialized in finding the vulnerabilities of kings, exposing their ambitions, and exploiting them until they destroyed themselves. King Huai of Chu was ambitious but deeply flawed. He wanted to expand Chu's holdings. He wanted prestige. He wanted to be recognized as a major power broker in the Warring States chessboard. What he lacked was patience and strategic caution. He often ignored the sober warnings of his ministers in favor of chasing grand promises. That weakness made him the perfect target for Zhang Yi. And then there was Chen Zhen, a minister of Chu, who tried to sound the alarm. Chen Zhen recognized that Qin's promises rarely matched Qin's actions. He urged his king to stay cautious, to value alliances over speculative offers. But like so many advisors in history, Chen Zhen's warnings were ignored, drowned out by the seductive prospect of easy gains. Now we get to the core of the story. Zhang Yi traveled to Chu with a clear mission: sever the Qi-Chu alliance. His weapon was not an army, but a promise. He approached King Huai and offered him 600 li of fertile territory. 600 li was no trivial gift. It meant control over a significant stretch of valuable land, an economic windfall that would strengthen Chu's resources and prestige. All Chu had to do was abandon its alliance with Qi. To King Huai, this looked like an opportunity to gain without sacrifice. He would get land for free. He would expand his kingdom's borders without spilling blood. It was a diplomatic deal that looked like pure profit, and that is exactly why it was a trap. Chen Zhen urged the king to resist. He pointed out that Qin had no incentive to actually deliver such a promise. He warned that once Chu severed its ties with Qi, it would be isolated and vulnerable. But King Huai did not want to hear it. He chose to believe Zhang Yi's words over his own minister's counsel. He severed relations with Qi, breaking the alliance that had protected Chu. At this point, Zhang Yi delivered the punchline. When pressed to deliver the promised land, Zhang Yi claimed there had been a misunderstanding. He had never promised 600 li of territory, he had only promised 6 li. 6 li is essentially nothing, barely a strip of land. The difference between 600 and 6 was deliberate. It was a deception designed to humiliate Chu once it was too late to reverse course.
King Huai was furious. His pride was wounded, his greed exposed. He ordered Chu's armies to attack Qin in retaliation, but Qin had calculated this outcome. Chu was now without allies. Qi had been abandoned, and the other states had little reason to come to Chu's defense. Qin's armies met Chu in battle and crushed them. Chu lost soldiers, lost territory, and lost face. King Huai himself later suffered personal humiliation when he was eventually lured into Qin and detained, dying in captivity. His reign became a case study in how a single misjudgment can define an entire legacy. The outcome of this episode was not just a defeat for Chu, it was a strategic victory for Qin. By breaking up the Qi-Chu alliance, Qin cleared the board for its eventual expansion. Qin's leaders understood that it was cheaper and more efficient to use deception than to send armies. A few clever words from Zhang Yi accomplished what thousands of troops might have failed to achieve. Qin had not only humiliated Chu, but also demonstrated to the other states that Qin's diplomats could be just as dangerous as Qin's generals. So what are the lessons here? First, greed is an enemy's easiest weapon. Qin never had to pressure Chu militarily, it only had to dangle land in front of a greedy king. Once a leader believes he is getting something for nothing, he becomes reckless. Second, alliances are worth more than territory. Chu thought it was trading an ally for land. In reality, it was trading long-term security for short-term illusion. Once isolated, it was doomed. Third, advice only matters if leaders are willing to hear it. Chen Jin understood the trap. He spoke clearly, but King Huai ignored him. This pattern repeats in history. Advisors can identify dangers, but leaders blinded by ambition often disregard them. And finally, Qin's strategy was systematic. Breaking coalitions through deception was not random, it was policy. Qin used diplomats like Zhang Yi to disarm enemies before sending generals like Bai Qi to finish the job. Chu's humiliation was one example in a broader campaign that eventually allowed Qin to unify China. Strip away the ancient names and the lessons are timeless. Leaders today, whether in politics, business, or international affairs, still face the same temptation, to take the deal that looks too good to resist. But hidden costs almost always outweigh gains. Think of alliances as intangible assets. They are harder to measure than money or land, but they are strategically priceless. Once broken, they cannot be easily restored. King Huai gave up an ally and received humiliation in return. Organizations or states that betray their partners for short-term promises often face the same fate: isolation and weakness. The core warning is simple: verify the deal, question the offer, and remember that the strongest shield against manipulation is not ambition, but skepticism. Zhang Yi's role in this story proves that unification was not only about soldiers and fortresses. Qin's success was also built on its diplomats, who turned allies into enemies and sowed division before a single battle began. King Huai's downfall shows how one poor decision, rooted in greed, can shift the balance of power across an entire system. Chu had the resources to stand strong, but with one reckless move, it condemned itself to decline. The larger lesson: power is not lost only on the battlefield. It is often lost in negotiations, in decisions made by leaders who cannot see past their own ambition. The story of Zhang Yi deceiving Chu is not a simple parable. It is a demonstration of how states rise and fall. Chu was not defeated first by Qin's armies. It was defeated by Qin's words. The lesson holds across time. When an offer seems too good to be true, it usually is. And when a leader abandons allies for illusions, the price is almost always isolation and ruin. That is the story of Zhang Yi's deception of Chu, a reminder that words can reshape history and that greed can destroy even the most powerful of kingdoms.